Welcome to CSP 340, Chapter 10, Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. We start with, as we almost always do, definitions. There are two sets of definitions that we want to look at. One is a definition of developmental disabilities, and the other is a definition of intellectual disabilities. So, developmental disabilities is a definition the federal government uses for birth to death of people who have disabilities. And so the features are, first is that it has to be attributable to a mental or physical impairment or a combination of mental and physical impairments. It has to be manifested before the individual attains age 22, and it has to be something that is likely to continue indefinitely. It focuses on functional limitations, so limitations in self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. And as a result of these functional limitations, the individual has a need for a combination and sequence of special, interdisciplinary, or generic services, supports, or other assistance that's of a lifelong or extended duration and is individually planned and coordinated. So that's the definition of DD, developmental disabilities. But then we have, in the special education law, we have the definition of intellectual disabilities. And it has three parts. The first part is significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. That means IQ below 70 or 2 standard deviations below the mean. The implication here is overall sub-average functioning, not isolated deficits. So it's not like learning disabilities where you could have a disability in just reading. When we're talking about significant sub-average general intellectual functioning, we're talking about throughout their functioning, they're going to be significantly below average. In Mississippi, by definition, the achievement scores have to be sub-average in every area measured. The second part is existing currently with deficits in adaptive behavior. So when we talk about adaptive behavior, we're talking about conceptual, social, practical skills that have been learned and performed by people in everyday life. It includes conceptual skills like language, reading, writing, math, money, time. It also includes social skills, interpersonal skills, and social responsibility and self-esteem, following rules, obeying laws, avoiding being victimized, and then practical skills like daily living and occupational skills and use of money. Again, it was in the other place too, wasn't it? Safety, healthcare, transportation, and so on. And the last part of the definition is that it has to be manifested in the developmental period. For some reason, the education definition cuts off at 21 and the other one cuts off at 22. I don't know what the difference is. Manifested means the behaviors are noted, not necessarily that there was a label attached. And this is to distinguish between an intellectual disability and a later brain injury. So if you had a intellectual disability diagnosed at age 16, for instance, then the understanding would be that you were still not fully developed cognitively. But if you had a brain injury when you were 25, then that occurred after you were fully developed. So you lost skills, but it's not preventing you from gaining new skills. And then that adversely affects the child's educational performance. All the definitions in IDEA have that phrase, if it's not an educational deficit, then IDEA doesn't cover it. So I put a supplemental video on causes attached to the page on Chapter 10. But this particular page, we're just going to look at a few of the most common types of intellectual disabilities, and these three are ones that your book specifically addressed.
According to the U.S. National Down Syndrome Society, currently 1 in every 733 babies born each year is diagnosed with Down syndrome. Simply put, Down syndrome is a condition caused by an abnormality in a person's chromosomes. When a child is conceived, he receives strands of DNA or chromosomes from his parents. In most cases of Down syndrome, though, a baby receives an extra copy of chromosome number 21 from one of his parents. There are several theories for why this chromosomal anomaly occurs, among them non-disjunction, which accounts for 95% of all Down's cases, translocation, which is thought to account for 4 to 5% of all cases, and mosaicism, which accounts for about 1%. Research has shown that non-disjunction, the most common reason thought to lead to Down syndrome, is influenced by maternal age. Statistically, a woman at age 25 has a 1 in 1,250 risk of having a baby with Down syndrome. At age 30, the risk is about 1 in 900. By age 35, it's about 1 in 350. By age 40, it's 1 in 100. And by 45, it's about 1 in 30. Interesting to note that even though the risk is greater as the mother's age increases, about 80% of babies with Down syndrome are born to women under age 35. This is because younger women have more babies than older women. It is this extra chromosome that causes the physical and mental delays characteristic of Down syndrome. Physically, people with Down syndrome tend to share certain physical features such as upward slanting eyes, flat facial profiles, a protruding tongue, small stature, low set ears, and a single deep crease across each palm. Every person with Down syndrome is a unique individual and may possess these characteristics to different degrees or not at all. Mentally, children with Down syndrome tend to have IQs that fall in the mild to moderate range of mental disability, though it's important to note that there is more to intelligence than what is tested for with IQ tests. Unfortunately, people with this disorder also tend to be at greater risk for other serious medical conditions like heart defects, which affect 35 to 50% of Down's patients. Children with Down syndrome are also more likely to have hearing and vision problems, leukemia, and thyroid conditions. Knowing all this, some parents-to-be decide to test for Down syndrome before their baby's birth. To do so, they can employ screening tests, diagnostic tests, or a combination of both. One of the most common screening tests is known as the nuchal translucency test, or NT, which is an ultrasound that measures the nuchal fold, which is the clear space in the tissue at the back of a developing baby's neck. Babies with abnormalities tend to accumulate more fluid at the back of their neck during the first trimester, causing this clear space to be larger than average. The NT scan must be done when you're between 11 and 14 weeks pregnant. It's usually offered along with a blood test in what's known as first trimester combined screening. It's important to understand that these screening tests are only a measure of whether a baby is likely to have Down syndrome. They do not offer a definitive diagnosis. For this reason, some parents decide to undergo more conclusive diagnostic tests. One diagnostic test is called chorionic villus sampling, or CVS, and involves extracting a small piece of a woman's placenta for testing. Chorionic villus sampling is usually performed between the 10th and 12th weeks of pregnancy. Because CVS is an invasive test, there's a small risk, about 1 in 100, that it can induce a miscarriage. Another test, called amniocentesis, involves collecting and testing a sample of the mother's amniotic fluid. It's generally performed between weeks 16 and 18 of a woman's pregnancy. The doctor inserts a hollow needle into the woman's abdomen to remove a small amount of amniotic fluid from around the developing fetus. This fluid contains the baby's chromosomes and can be tested to check for genetic problems and to determine the sex of the child. Amniocentesis also carries a slight risk of inducing a miscarriage, which ranges from 1 in 200 to 1 in 1,000. For both diagnostic tests, much depends on the skill and experience of the person performing the test, so ask what the individual doctor's rate of miscarriage is before consenting to do the test with him or her. After birth, a simple blood test can confirm a diagnosis of Down syndrome if necessary. While Down syndrome can be scary, the life expectancy of people with the disorder is increasing all the time, from 25 in 1983 to 60 today, according to the National Down Syndrome Society. People with Down syndrome can often go to school, work, live semi-independently, and even get married. The best way to ensure a bright future like this is to get early intervention for your child. One-on-one work with early childhood educators and speech, occupational, and physical therapists can all help encourage development. Remember, if you are a parent to a child with Down syndrome, you are not alone. Some 250,000 Americans have Down syndrome. Help your child and help yourself by becoming as educated about Down syndrome as possible.
Hello, I'm Congressman Greg Hartley from Mississippi. My wife Sydney and I want to tell you about our precious 19-year-old son, Livingston. Early in his life, we noticed he was slow to walk, talk, and reach other developmental milestones. He would flap his hands, rock back and forth, and chew on objects. We were told not to be concerned, that he was developmentally delayed and that he would grow out of it. Finally, at about 19 months of age, our doctor told us that something was wrong, that he didn't know what it was, but that we would start looking. The next 2 years were filled with occupational therapy, speech therapy, testing, and hospitals. Sydney dealt with these issues every day. Livingston was misdiagnosed with mild cerebral palsy and was said to be a near miss on autism. Almost 2 years later, Livingston was tested and found to have Fragile X syndrome. For our family, Fragile X has become a lifelong labor of love and daily blessings. With diploma in hand, Livingston graduated from Pearl High School last May. He works part-time at a local restaurant and now takes classes at a local community college. As the only member of Congress who has a child with Fragile X, I understand the challenges that face thousands of families who experience this condition. Sydney and I are committed to making sure that there is increased awareness and funding to help those families who are blessed with a child with Fragile X. On March 4th, 130 advocates from 35 states from the National Fragile X Foundation will travel to Capitol Hill for our National Advocacy Day. Fragile X syndrome is the most common cause of inherited intellectual disability, resulting in a wide range of mental and physical impairment. Fragile X-associated disorders include 3 separate and distinct conditions. As many as 1 in 130 women are estimated to be carriers of the Fragile X mutation, according to current studies. Congress has the ability to support additional federal funding for the treatment and cure of Fragile X-associated disorders. However, we cannot advance this bipartisan effort without your support and ask for your help.
The third that your book talks about is fetal alcohol syndrome. And fetal alcohol syndrome is the leading prenatal cause of intellectual disabilities. You can see here that what happens is that the alcohol actually causes a shrinkage of the brain in both the corpus callosum and in the cerebellum. And the effect of that is that in the corpus callosum, which is where you have communications, motor, sensory, cognitive information, communication between your 2 hemispheres of your brain, then what happens is if you have prenatal exposure to that, then you have problems with storing and retrieving information, problem solving, attention, and verbal memory. If the cerebellum is affected, then the problem that we have here, and that's here, is the cerebellum, that it processes input from other areas of the brain to coordinate motor and cognitive skills. And so a person who is affected prenatally in their cerebellum, they're going to have problems controlling movements, maintaining balance, and fine motor skills. One of the major problems that we have with fetal alcohol syndrome, though, has to do with the person's behavior, that they have trouble understanding cause and effect, and this affects many areas of their life. This is the first part of chapter 10, and there will be one more video on the second part.